At 7:32 a.m. on January the 2nd, 1963, Captain Ken Good leaned out of the open door of a CH-21 Shawnee helicopter, watching the rice paddies of Ap Bac rush toward him at 90 miles per hour. The morning fog clung to the Mekong Delta like wet gauze. He could see the tree line 400 yards ahead, dark and silent, where intelligence said 120 Viet Cong were hiding. The helicopter shuddered as the pilot began the descent. Good checked his M16 one more time. In the next 8 minutes, 5 American helicopters would be shot out of the sky by an enemy armed with nothing but rifles and machine guns. The tactics that brought them down would change helicopter warfare forever and shatter America's confidence that technology could win this war. But nobody in that helicopter knew any of that yet. They were about to land in a carefully prepared killing field that had been waiting for them since dawn. Kenneth Vernon Good was 32 years old that morning. Born in Honolulu, Hawaii, he'd grown up watching the Pacific Fleet come and go from Pearl Harbor. His father worked as a civilian contractor for the Navy, repairing the ships that had survived December 7, 1941. Ken was 8 years old when the Japanese attacked, old enough to remember the columns of smoke rising over Battleship Row, the sound of anti-aircraft fire that went on for what seemed like hours, the way his mother pulled him and his younger sister into the bathtub and covered them with mattresses because she didn't know what else to do. That morning shaped everything that came after. He enlisted in the Army at 18 right after high school because the Navy reminded him too much of burning ships and drowning men. The Army meant staying on land, staying in control, staying alive. He went through officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia, graduated second in his class, specialized in infantry tactics and small unit leadership. He was good at reading terrain, understanding how ground and vegetation affected movement and visibility. His instructors noted that he had an intuitive grasp of battlefield geometry, the ability to see how pieces would move before they moved. By 1962, he'd served 9 years, made captain, married a woman named Patricia from Ewa Beach, who taught elementary school and wanted children. They had none yet. The war kept getting in the way. He deployed to South Vietnam in August 1962 as a senior advisor to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, 7th Infantry Division, stationed in Dinh Tuong Province in the Mekong Delta, 40 miles southwest of Saigon. His job was to help South Vietnamese commanders plan operations, coordinate American helicopter and air support, and try to win a war against an enemy that refused to fight the way armies were supposed to fight. The 7th ARVN Division was considered one of the best in South Vietnam. Its commander, Colonel Huyen Van Cao, was ambitious, politically connected, and cautious about casualties because President Ngo Dinh Diem measured loyalty by how many soldiers you brought home alive. Cao's American advisor was Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Van, a 38-year-old career officer who believed the war could be won through aggressive action and superior firepower. Van had fought in Korea, where he'd learned that hesitation killed more men than boldness. He pushed Chow constantly to engage the enemy, to use the helicopters and armored personnel carriers the Americans were providing, to take the fight to the Viet Cong instead of waiting for them to strike first. By late 1962, the approach seemed to be working. The 7th Division claimed to have killed more than 4,000 Viet Cong in the last 3 months of the year, more than any other division in South Vietnam. The Americans were teaching the South Vietnamese how to use mobility and technology to find and destroy an insurgent force. Helicopters were the key. They let government troops bypass VC ambushes on roads, land in areas the enemy thought were safe, attack from unexpected directions. The CH-21 Shawnee, called the Flying Banana because of its curved fuselage, could carry 12 soldiers and their equipment into places no truck or boat could reach. The UH-1 Huey gunship could provide covering fire with rockets and machine guns. Together, they were revolutionizing how the war was fought, or so everyone thought. On December 28, 1962, American intelligence intercepted a Viet Cong radio transmission coming from the hamlet of Ap Bac in Din Tuong Province. The signal was strong and consistent, indicating a fixed transmitter rather than a portable unit. That was unusual. The Viku normally moved their radios constantly to avoid detection. A fixed transmitter meant they felt safe, which meant they'd been in the area long enough to get comfortable. Intelligence estimated the transmitter was guarded by approximately 120 VC soldiers, maybe 2 companies. Van saw an opportunity. A force that size, caught in the open, could be destroyed with a coordinated attack using helicopters, armored personnel carriers, artillery, and air support. It would be a demonstration of what American tactics and South Vietnamese execution could accomplish together. He pushed Chow hard to approve the operation. Chow was reluctant. Intelligence about VC strength was often wrong, usually low. But Van was persistent, and Chow finally agreed to commit the 7th Division to a multi-battalion attack on January 2, 1963. The plan was textbook. Captain Richard Ziegler, another American advisor, worked with the 7th Division staff to draft the operational scheme. An ARVN infantry battalion would fly by CH-21 helicopters to landing zones north of Ap Bac and attack south toward the hamlet. From the south, 2 Civil Guard battalions under the Din Tuong provincial chief would march north through the rice-paddies. From the west, an infantry company riding with 13 M113 armored personnel carriers would assault the VC positions once they were fixed by the other forces. The total attacking force numbered about 1,200 troops. Artillery would be pre-positioned to provide fire support. Fighter bombers would be on call. Van would coordinate everything from a small observation plane flying above the battlefield, directing the various elements like pieces on a chessboard. The VC, caught in a 3-sided trap, would either be destroyed or forced to flee east across open ground where artillery and airstrikes would finish them off. It was the kind of operation that had worked repeatedly throughout 1962. What nobody knew was that the Viet Cong were expecting them. The 261st VC Battalion had been operating in the area for months. Its commander, Senior Captain Hoang Van Thai, was a veteran of the war against the French, a careful planner who understood that the Americans had given the South Vietnamese 2 overwhelming advantages: helicopters that provided mobility and M113 armored personnel carriers that were nearly invulnerable to small arms fire. Most VC units fled when they heard helicopters or saw the M113s, which the guerrillas called Green Dragons because of their color and their seeming invincibility. Hoang decided his battalion would do something different. They would stand and fight. They would prove that determination and proper preparation could defeat American technology. The VC had multiple sources of intelligence about the coming attack. Pham Xuan An, a well-connected journalist working for Reuters in Saigon, was actually a deep-cover VC agent with access to American and South Vietnamese planning documents. He'd passed detailed information about ARVN equipment and tactics to VC intelligence officers. Local guerrillas in Din Tuong Province reported the arrival of 71 truckloads of ammunition and supplies from Saigon on December 30th, an unmistakable sign that a major operation was coming. The VC also intercepted ARVN radio communications because South Vietnamese commanders often failed to use proper encryption or code words. By the evening of January 1st, Hoang knew an attack was coming the next morning, knew the general plan, and knew he had time to prepare. He had approximately 320 regular VC soldiers from 2 companies of the 201st and 514th Battalions, plus about 30 local guerrillas who would serve as scouts and stretcher-bearers. He positioned them along a tree line bordering the hamlet of Ap Bac, about a mile south of Ap Tan Thoi, where the South Vietnamese would have to pass to reach their objective. The terrain favored the defenders. Rice paddies stretched for hundreds of yards on 3 sides, flat and open, with no cover except the low dikes that separated the fields. Anyone advancing across those paddies would be completely exposed. The tree line where Hoang positioned his troops was thick with brush and provided excellent concealment. Behind the trees ran an irrigation canal that would serve as a fallback position if needed. Hoang had his men dig foxholes and firing positions along the tree line, spacing them so each position could provide covering fire for its neighbors. He positioned his heavier weapons, including several .30 caliber Browning machine guns captured from ARVN forces, to cover the most likely approach routes. He made his soldiers practice anti-helicopter drills. When helicopters came into land, they were slow, vulnerable, predictable. They hovered or flew at low speed just before touching down. That was when they could be hit. Hoang instructed his machine gunners to aim at the helicopter's transmission housing, the mechanical heart of the aircraft, located just above the passenger compartment. Disable the transmission, and the helicopter couldn't fly. He told them to fire disciplined volleys, not wild spraying. Aimed fire would bring down aircraft. Panic fire would waste ammunition, and then they waited. The night of January 1st was clear and cold. Hoang moved among his positions, checking fields of fire, making sure each soldier knew his job. He told them they were going to make history. They were going to show that the Americans could be beaten, that helicopters could be destroyed, that the Green Dragons could be stopped. His men believed him. They'd been fighting long enough to trust their commander. When dawn broke on January the 2nd, a heavy fog covered the rice paddies. Hoang smiled. The fog would delay the helicopters, give his men time to prepare mentally, let the tension build until they were ready to explode into action. At 6:45 a.m., they heard the first helicopters approaching from the north. The Civil Guard battalions attacking from the south were already in contact, pinned down by VC fire about 100 yards from the tree line, where Hoang's main force waited. The soldiers could hear the shooting to the south, the sound of M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles echoing across the paddies. But Hoang's orders were clear: hold fire, let the helicopters land, let the soldiers get out. Then open fire when they're most vulnerable, when they're transitioning from the security of the aircraft to the exposure of the rice paddy. That's when you hurt them. That's when you make them understand what this war really is. At 7:30 a.m., the fog began to lift. 10 CH-21 helicopters carrying the 1st Company of the ARVN 11th Infantry Regiment approached from the north, escorted by 5 UH-1 Huey gunships. The formation flew low, maybe 50 feet above the rice paddies, the standard altitude for troop insertions. The pilots couldn't see the tree line clearly through the morning haze, couldn't see the foxholes or the machine guns waiting there. They flew toward their designated landing zone, a flat area about 200 yards north of Ap Bac, the same area they'd landed in dozens of times before during other operations. The same procedures, the same altitude, the same approach pattern, predictable, rehearsed, professional, and therefore vulnerable. Captain Good was in the lead helicopter, the first to touch down. The pilot, a young warrant officer named Jim Ferguson from the 93rd Transportation Company, brought the CH-21 in at a hover about 4 feet off the ground. The crew chief slid the door open. Good prepared to jump out and establish a perimeter while the rest of the ARVN infantry unloaded behind him. That's when the tree line erupted. The first burst of machine gun fire hit Ferguson's helicopter in the transmission housing, exactly where Hoang had told his gunners to aim. The transmission seized immediately. The helicopter dropped hard, slamming into the paddy at an angle. Good was thrown forward, caught himself on the doorframe, felt the impact through his boots and knees as the aircraft hit. Metal screamed. The rotors were still spinning, but the drive shaft was gone. The helicopter was dead. Good scrambled out, dragged 2 ARVN soldiers with him, ran toward the nearest dike and threw himself behind it. Mud and water splashed across his face. Bullets snapped overhead, that distinctive crack of supersonic rounds passing close. He looked back and saw the other helicopters scattering, trying to abort their landings, but they were too committed, too low, moving too slowly. The second helicopter took multiple hits to the fuselage and engine compartment. It managed to gain some altitude, maybe 30 feet, before the engine failed completely. The pilot auto-rotated down, a controlled crash into the paddy about 50 yards from Good's position. The helicopter hit hard, flipped on its side. Good saw soldiers spilling out of the cargo door, some injured, some crawling, some firing their weapons back at the tree line, even though they couldn't see any targets. The third and fourth helicopters in the formation were hit almost simultaneously. The third took rounds through the hydraulic system and lost control, crashing nose first into a dike. The fourth helicopter's pilot, seeing the carnage ahead, tried to pull up and abort the landing. He gained altitude to about 100 feet before VC fire shredded his tail rotor. The helicopter spun once, twice, 3 times, then fell out of the sky like a dropped stone. It hit so hard, the landing skids collapsed, and the fuselage buckled. The fifth helicopter was the only one that escaped the initial ambush. Its pilot, seeing 4 aircraft down and the landing zone under heavy fire, pulled full power and climbed out to the east, taking hits but staying airborne. The formation of 5 UH-1 gunships tried to suppress the VC positions, making firing runs along the tree line with rockets and machine guns, but they couldn't see the enemy troops who were well concealed in their foxholes and firing positions. One of the Hueys, flown by Chief Warrant Officer Charles Gilroy, got too low during a gun run. VC machine gunners concentrated fire on the aircraft. Gilroy took multiple rounds through the cockpit. The helicopter lost power and went down, crashing into the rice-paddy in full view of Good and the other soldiers trapped on the ground. In less than 5 minutes, 5 American helicopters had been shot down. 15 aircrew were dead, wounded, or trapped in the wreckage. Dozens of ARVN soldiers were pinned down in the open with no cover except shallow irrigation dikes that provided minimal protection from the sustained machine gun fire coming from the tree line. Good tried to organize a perimeter, get the ARVN soldiers to return fire, establish some kind of defensive position. But the South Vietnamese troops were scattered, disorganized, many of them in shock from the crash landings and the intensity of the VC fire. Some were shooting wildly in the general direction of the tree line. Others were trying to burrow into the mud like it might save them. Good moved among them, shouting orders, pulling men into better positions, trying to get his radio working so he could call for help. The radio was soaked, covered in mud, giving nothing but static. He switched to his backup handset, got a partial signal, managed to reach the command post and report that they were taking heavy casualties, that multiple helicopters were down, that they needed immediate support. Overhead, Lieutenant Colonel Van circled in his small observation plane, watching the disaster unfold. He could see the downed helicopters, see the soldiers pinned down in the paddies, see the muzzle flashes from the tree line where the VC were positioned. He called for artillery fire, directed fighter bombers to make strike runs against the enemy positions, ordered more helicopters to attempt a rescue of the trapped crews and infantry. The artillery rounds fell, 105mm shells impacting along the tree line in explosions of mud and vegetation. The fighter bombers came in, F-100 Super Sabres dropping 500-pound bombs and napalm canisters that turned sections of the tree line into walls of flame. But the VC had prepared for this too. Their foxholes had overhead cover. Their positions were dispersed enough that artillery and bombs couldn't hit all of them at once. After each strike, after each bombardment, the machine guns would start firing again. The Americans had the technology. The VC had the will and the preparation. By 8:30 a.m., the Civil Guard battalions attacking from the south had made no progress. They were still pinned down 100 yards from the tree line, taking casualties every time someone raised their head above a dike. The M113 armored personnel carrier force that was supposed to attack from the west hadn't moved yet. Its commander, Captain Lai Tong Ba, insisted he needed authorization from higher command before advancing into the battle. The American advisor assigned to BA, Captain James Scanlon, was practically begging him to move, to use the M113s to rescue the trapped helicopter crews, but Ba refused. He'd been ordered to hold his position until told otherwise, and he wasn't about to risk his career and his men by violating those orders. Scanlon radioed back to division headquarters, to Van, to anyone who would listen. "People are dying out there. We have to move." Ba wouldn't budge. Captain Good, still pinned down behind the dike, could see one of the crashed helicopters about 30 yards away. The crew was still alive, waving for help, but the VC fire was too heavy for anyone to reach them. Every time an ARVN soldier tried to move forward, machine gun fire would erupt from the tree line and drive them back. Good realized that without armored support, without some way to suppress or flank the VC positions, they weren't going anywhere. They were stuck. The VC had planned this perfectly. They'd studied how the Americans operated, learned the patterns, identified the vulnerabilities, and exploited every single one of them. The helicopters landed in the same place every time. The approach routes were predictable. The tactics hadn't changed since the first helicopter operations back in early 1962. The VC had been watching, learning, preparing, and now they were executing a masterpiece of ambush warfare. At 9:15 a.m., more helicopters arrived to attempt a rescue. 3 CH-21s and 3 UH-1 gunships flew in from Ton Heap Air Base, having been scrambled as soon as word of the disaster reached headquarters. The pilots knew they were flying into a kill zone, knew that 5 helicopters had already been shot down, but they came anyway because men were trapped on the ground, and the mission was to get them out. The formation approached from the east, trying a different direction than the original landing, hoping to surprise the VC or find a less heavily defended approach. It didn't work. The VPI simply shifted their fire. The machine guns opened up again as soon as the helicopters came into range. All 6 aircraft took hits. One of the CH-21s, piloted by Captain Robert Mays, lost its hydraulics and crash-landed in the paddy, becoming the 6th American helicopter destroyed that day. Mays and his crew survived the crash, scrambled out, and joined the growing cluster of stranded Americans and South Vietnamese troops huddled behind whatever cover they could find. The remaining helicopters aborted their landing attempts and pulled away, their fuselages riddled with bullet holes, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines, instruments shattered. One pilot counted 37 bullet holes in his aircraft when he got back to base. Another had lost all his radios and was flying by hand signals from his crew chief. The UH-1 gunships had expended all their ammunition, making ineffective gun runs against enemy positions they couldn't see or couldn't hit. The battlefield had become a stalemate. The VC couldn't advance across the open ground without exposing themselves to American air power. The Americans and South Vietnamese couldn't assault the tree line without armored support, and the armored support still hadn't moved. At 10:45 a.m., nearly 3 hours after the initial ambush, Van finally convinced Captain B.A. to move his M113 force toward the battlefield. Bia agreed, reluctantly, but insisted on moving slowly and methodically. The 13 armored personnel carriers began advancing across the rice paddies toward Ap Bac, their drivers carefully maneuvering around the deeper sections where the vehicles might bog down. The VC watched them come. Huang had predicted this. He'd told his men the green dragons would eventually arrive, and when they did, the battle would change. The M113s were nearly invulnerable to small arms fire. Their aluminum armor could stop rifle rounds and machine gun bullets. The only way to hurt them was to get close enough to throw grenades into the open cargo hatches or to hit them with something heavier than a rifle. The VC had neither. What they did have was discipline and patience. At 1:30 p.m., 4.5 hours after the battle began, the M113 column reached the area where the helicopters had been shot down. The vehicles stopped to pick up survivors and drop off infantry for the assault on the tree line. Captain Good, exhausted, covered in mud, his uniform torn and blood-stained from helping wounded soldiers, climbed onto one of the M113s. He briefed the South Vietnamese lieutenant commanding the vehicle, pointed out where he thought the VC positions were located based on the muzzle flashes he'd been watching all morning. The lieutenant nodded, seemed to understand. The plan was simple. The M113s would advance in a line toward the tree line, their .50 caliber machine guns suppressing the enemy positions. The dismounted infantry would follow behind the vehicles, using them as cover, then rush the tree line once they got close enough. It was a tactic that had worked repeatedly throughout 1962. The VC always fled when the M113s arrived, except this time they didn't. The M113 column advanced to within 50 yards of the tree line. The VC opened fire with everything they had, machine guns and rifles all firing at once. The bullets sparked off the armor of the M113s, ineffective against the metal, but terrifying in their volume and intensity. The dismounted ARVN infantry, following behind the vehicles, took immediate casualties. Men dropped, hit by fire they couldn't see coming from an enemy they couldn't locate. The infantry broke, running back toward the downed helicopters, away from the killing zone. The M113 gunners, exposed in their open hatches, became the VC's primary targets. The vehicles themselves couldn't be penetrated, but the men operating the .50 caliber machine guns were vulnerable. VC marksmen began targeting the gunners specifically. One fell, shot through the chest. Another was hit in the shoulder and collapsed into the vehicle. A third took a round through the helmet that somehow didn't penetrate but knocked him unconscious. The vehicles began backing up, their gunners dead or wounded, their supporting infantry scattered. Captain Scanlon, the American advisor, tried to rally the South Vietnamese troops, running forward on foot, pointing toward the tree line, shouting for them to advance. an ARVN lieutenant who spoke English told him, "They will kill you, sir. They will kill all of us." Scanlon didn't listen. He kept moving forward until a VC machine gunner put 3 rounds into the ground at his feet. He finally understood this wasn't going to work. The VC weren't fleeing. They were prepared to fight the M113s, prepared to accept casualties, prepared to die in their positions if necessary. The psychological advantage the Green Dragons had provided for the past year was gone. Captain Good watched the M113 assault fall apart from his position near the downed helicopters. He'd been fighting for 7 hours by then, since 7:30 that morning, and he understood they weren't going to win this one. The best they could hope for was to hold their positions until dark and then extract under cover of night. He moved among the ARVN soldiers again, trying to organize a defensive perimeter, treating wounded, rationing water and ammunition. He found Captain Mays, the pilot whose helicopter had been shot down during the second rescue attempt, and together they tried to coordinate with Van, who was still overhead directing airstrikes and artillery. Van wanted one more push, one more assault on the tree line. Good told him it wasn't going to happen. The South Vietnamese troops were exhausted, demoralized, pinned down. Another assault would just produce more casualties for no gain. At 2:30 p.m., 8 hours into the battle, General Huyen Van Cao arrived at the 7th Division command post to take personal command of the operation. Cao was furious. He'd authorized what was supposed to be a simple operation against 120 VC, and instead he had 5 helicopters destroyed, 3 American advisors dead or dying, more than 60 ARVN soldiers killed or wounded, and an enemy force that showed no sign of retreating. He ordered massive artillery barrages and airstrikes against Ap Bac and the surrounding tree lines. Fighter bombers dropped napalm that turned sections of the hamlet into infernos. Artillery batteries fired hundreds of rounds, cratering the ground, shredding vegetation, pounding the VC positions with high explosive and white phosphorus. The shelling went on for more than an hour, a demonstration of American firepower that was supposed to destroy anything still alive in those trees. When the smoke cleared, the VC machine guns started firing again. Not all of them, but enough to make the point. They were still there. They were still fighting. At 4:00 p.m., Cao ordered an airborne battalion to drop north of Ap Bac to cut off the VC retreat route. The paratroopers jumped from C-123 transports, their parachutes filling the sky like white flowers. The drop was supposed to land them 500 yards north of the hamlet, in position to block the VC's escape. Instead, because of navigation errors or wind or simple bad luck, they came down right on top of another ARVN unit that was already in position to the north. The paratroopers landed in trees, in rice paddies, scattered across a mile of ground. Some landed within 100 yards of VC positions and were shot as they descended or before they could get out of their parachutes. Others got hung up in trees and had to cut themselves free while taking fire from the ground. The airborne drop, which was supposed to seal the trap, instead produced more chaos and more casualties. At 5:30 p.m., as the sun began to set over the Mekong Delta, Captain Good got the order to prepare for withdrawal. Helicopters would extract the remaining troops under cover of darkness and artillery fire. The dead would be recovered. The wounded would be evacuated. The operation was over. The VC had won. That night, as darkness fell over the battlefield, the Viet Cong slipped away. They carried their dead and wounded with them, moving east through rice paddies and along canals that ARVN forces hadn't thought to block. By dawn on January 3rd, Ap Bac was empty. The tree line that had been defended so fiercely was abandoned. The foxholes were empty. The machine gun positions were silent. The VC had fought for an entire day against overwhelming firepower and superior numbers, had shot down 5 American helicopters and damaged 9 others, had killed or wounded more than 150 ARVN soldiers and American advisors, and then had walked away into the darkness. Captain Kenneth Good didn't walk away. At 3:45 p.m. on January 2nd, during the 7th hour of the battle, he'd led a small group of ARVN soldiers in an attempt to reach one of the downed helicopter crews that was still trapped between the ARVN positions and the VC tree line. They'd made it about 30 yards before VC machine gunners opened fire. Good took 3 rounds across his chest and neck, fired from maybe 75 yards away by a marksman who'd been waiting all day for someone to make exactly that kind of move. The ARVN soldiers with him dragged him back behind the dike, but there was nothing they could do. The wounds were catastrophic. He died within minutes, still trying to give orders, still trying to get his men to safety. They got his body out that night, along with the other dead. The Army sent his remains home to Hawaii. Patricia Good received the telegram on January 4th. The funeral was on January 12th. She was 29 years old and pregnant with a daughter she didn't know she was carrying yet. The Army gave her a folded flag and told her that her husband had died a hero, leading his men under fire, trying to save trapped helicopter crews, all of which was true. What they didn't tell her was that he died in a battle that should never have been fought the way it was fought, against an enemy the Americans had underestimated, using tactics that the VC had learned to counter. The Battle of Ap Bac ended with 83 South Vietnamese soldiers dead and more than 100 wounded. 3 Americans died: Good, Sergeant William Deal, and Specialist Donald Brahman. 5 helicopters were destroyed. 9 more were damaged so badly they required extensive repairs. The Viet Cong lost approximately 18 killed and 39 wounded, though exact numbers were never confirmed. By any measure of military effectiveness, it was a disaster for the South Vietnamese and their American advisors, but the real damage wasn't in the casualty figures, it was in what the battle revealed. For more than a year, American commanders in Vietnam had been telling Washington that the war was being won, that the combination of American technology and South Vietnamese troops was steadily defeating the insurgency. Helicopters were the symbol of that success. They gave the South Vietnamese mobility the VC couldn't match. Let them strike anywhere, any time, with minimal risk. Ap Bac proved that was an illusion. The VC could shoot down helicopters. They could stand and fight against superior firepower. They could plan and execute complex ambushes that neutralized American advantages. And they could do it with nothing more than rifles, machine guns, and the will to stay in their positions while bombs and napalm fell around them. The American reporters who covered the battle understood what it meant. Neil Sheehan of United Press International, David Halberstam of the New York Times, and Peter Arnett of Associated Press had all been at the battlefield or flown over it during the fighting. They'd seen the downed helicopters. They'd talked to the angry, exhausted American advisors who'd spent hours watching South Vietnamese commanders refuse to fight or botch operations through incompetence and timidity. Their stories painted a picture that contradicted everything the official military briefers in Saigon had been saying. Sheehan wrote that ARVN troops had refused direct orders to advance, that American advisors were pleading with them to attack while they cowered behind dikes. Halberstam reported that the Viet Cong had won a major victory despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Arnett described the battle as a humiliating defeat that exposed fundamental problems with how the war was being fought. General Paul Harkins, commander of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, was furious. He'd been at the battlefield briefly on January the 2nd, had talked to reporters and told them the battle was a success, that the VC were trapped and about to be destroyed. When he found out the VC had escaped and that the reporters were calling it a defeat, he held a press conference to push back. He insisted that the battle had inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy, that the helicopter losses were acceptable, that the operation had achieved its objectives even if the VC transmitter hadn't been captured. Few believed him. The gap between what the military said and what reporters were seeing on the ground was becoming a chasm. In Washington, President John F. Kennedy read the news reports and began asking hard questions. How could the South Vietnamese, with every advantage, lose to a much smaller VC force? Why were American helicopters so vulnerable? What were the advisors doing if they couldn't get ARVN commanders to fight? The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, demanded explanations. The Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered investigations. Everyone wanted to know what had gone wrong at Ap Bac and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. The answer was complicated. Part of the problem was intelligence. The Americans thought they were facing 120 VC when the real number was more than 300. Part was planning. The operation assumed the VC would behave the way they'd behaved before, fleeing when confronted with helicopters and armored vehicles. Part was execution. The South Vietnamese commanders were too cautious, too slow, too reluctant to take risks that might produce casualties. Part was luck. The morning fog delayed the helicopter insertions, giving the VC time to prepare. The paratroop drop landed in the wrong place. The M113s took too long to arrive. But the deeper problem was something the Americans didn't want to acknowledge. The Viet Cong were learning. They were studying American tactics, identifying patterns, finding vulnerabilities, and developing counters. The helicopter operations that had been so successful in 1962 worked because they were new, and the VC didn't know how to respond. By January 1963, they'd figured it out. The same landing zones used repeatedly, the same approach altitudes, the same flight patterns, the same reluctance to take casualties that made ARVN commanders predictable. The VC learned all of it and planned accordingly. Hoang Van Thai, the VC commander at Ap Bac, became a hero in North Vietnam. His battle plan was studied and replicated by other units. Anti-helicopter tactics were refined and distributed throughout VC forces operating in the South. Within 6 months of Ap Bac, American helicopter losses began increasing across the country. The tactics that worked in early 1962 became increasingly dangerous by mid-1963. Pilots had to change their approaches, vary their altitudes, use different landing zones for each operation. Suppressive fire before landing became standard procedure. The casual confidence that had characterized early helicopter operations was gone, replaced by the understanding that every insertion was dangerous, every landing zone could be an ambush. The CH-21 Shawnee, the flying banana that had seemed so revolutionary in 1962, was recognized as obsolete. It was slow, it was loud, it was vulnerable. By 1964, it was being phased out and replaced by the UH-1 Huey, which was faster, more maneuverable, and better armed. But the fundamental problem remained. Helicopters flying low and slow to insert troops would always be vulnerable to ground fire, no matter how good the aircraft. The only solutions were to avoid predictable patterns, to use overwhelming suppressive fire, and to accept that losses were inevitable. The men who flew those helicopters knew the risks. Between 1961 and 1975, More than 5,000 American helicopters were destroyed in Vietnam. More than 2,000 pilots died. More than 2,700 crew members were killed. Being a helicopter pilot or crew chief in Vietnam was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. The losses at Ap Bac on January 2, 1963, were just the beginning. What made Ap Bac significant wasn't just the tactical defeat. It was what the battle revealed about the entire war effort. The Americans had superior technology, superior firepower, superior mobility. But the enemy had superior motivation, superior knowledge of the terrain, and superior patience. The war couldn't be won by technology alone. It required political will, competent local allies, and a strategy that accounted for the enemy's strengths rather than dismissing them. Ap Bac showed that none of those conditions existed in South Vietnam in 1963. The political leadership in Saigon was corrupt and unpopular. The military commanders were cautious and political. The troops were poorly motivated and often unwilling to fight. And the Americans, despite their good intentions and massive investment of resources, couldn't fix those problems by providing better equipment or more advisors. The Viet Cong understood this in a way the Americans didn't. They knew they couldn't win through conventional military operations. They didn't have the firepower or the resources. What they could do was outlast the Americans, make the war so costly and frustrating that eventually the United States would give up and go home. Every battle like Ap Bac, every helicopter shot down, every operation that ended in failure, despite overwhelming advantages, pushed that timeline forward. The reporters who covered Ap Bac understood this too. Sheehan, Halberstam, and Arnett would go on to win Pulitzer Prizes for their Vietnam coverage. Their reporting from Ap Bac was part of what earned those awards. They'd seen through the official optimism and recognized the truth. The war wasn't being won. The South Vietnamese couldn't or wouldn't fight effectively. The American strategy was flawed, and unless something fundamental changed, the United States was heading toward defeat. General Harkins never forgave them for that reporting. He accused them of being negative, of focusing on failures while ignoring successes, of undermining morale and giving comfort to the enemy. Other military commanders would echo those complaints throughout the war. But the reporters were right. Ap Bac was a warning that went unheeded. The Battle of Ap Bac was studied extensively in the years after the war. Military historians identified it as a turning point, the moment when the Viet Cong demonstrated they could counter American technological advantages through discipline, preparation, and tactics adapted to local conditions. The helicopter ambush techniques pioneered at Ap Bac would be used throughout the war, refined and improved as the VC and later the North Vietnamese Army gained access to heavier weapons like the Soviet-made 12.7 or DSHK anti-aircraft machine gun, and eventually the SA-7 Grail, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. American pilots learned to respect those weapons and the men who used them. The myth of invulnerability that characterized early helicopter operations was gone forever after Ap Bac. The battle also influenced how the U.S. military thought about helicopter warfare in general. The lessons from Vietnam, particularly the vulnerability of helicopters to ground fire and the importance of suppressive fire and combined arms operations, shaped doctrine for decades afterward. Modern military helicopters are faster, more heavily armed, and better armored than the CH-21s and early UH-1s that flew at Ap Bac. But the fundamental truth remains the same. Aircraft that have to fly low and slow are vulnerable, and the only way to protect them is through careful planning, varied tactics, and acceptance of risk. For the families of the men who died at Ap Bac, the battle's strategic significance was meaningless. Patricia Good raised her daughter alone in Hawaii, never remarrying, never fully recovering from the loss. She kept Kenneth's medals and letters in a box in her closet, and sometimes, late at night, she'd take them out and read them and try to remember exactly what his voice sounded like. She died in 1994, never having returned to Vietnam, never having seen the battlefield where her husband fell. The daughter she was carrying when Kenneth died, named Karen after his mother, joined the Air Force and served for 20 years as a logistics officer, determined to honor her father's service even though she'd never known him. She retired as a lieutenant colonel. She visited Ap Bac in 2013, 50 years after the battle, and stood in the rice paddies where the helicopters had been shot down. The paddies looked the same as they had in 1963. The tree line where the VC had dug their positions was still there, though the trees were different ones now, taller and older. Local farmers worked the fields, planting rice the way their grandparents had done during the war. Karen wondered if any of them remembered, if any of them had been there that day when the helicopters fell from the sky. She didn't ask. Some things are better left as memory rather than conversation. The helicopter that Ken Good died trying to reach, the one whose crew was trapped between the ARVN positions and the VC guns, was never recovered intact. It was dismantled and hauled away piece by piece after the battle, its components distributed to maintenance depots and eventually recycled into other aircraft or scrapped. The other 4 helicopters shot down that day met similar fates. Nothing remains of them now except photographs, official reports, and the memories of men who are themselves mostly gone. But the tactics that brought them down, the understanding that helicopters could be defeated through discipline and proper preparation, survived. Those tactics spread throughout the Vietnamese Communist forces and eventually to other insurgent groups around the world who studied Vietnam and learned its lessons. The fundamental dynamic of helicopter warfare, the tension between mobility and vulnerability, remains unchanged. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, who'd orchestrated the Ap Bac operation and watched it fall apart from his observation plane, never accepted the defeat. He blamed the South Vietnamese commanders, blamed their timidity and incompetence, insisted that with better execution the battle could have been won. He stayed in Vietnam, left the Army in 1963, but returned as a civilian advisor, rose to become one of the most influential Americans in the country, and died in a helicopter crash in 1972, killed not by enemy fire, but by weather and pilot error. His story became one of the central narratives of the American experience in Vietnam, documented in Neil Sheehan's book, A Bright, Shining Lie. The battle at Ap Bac appears in that book, one episode in Van's long and ultimately tragic attempt to win an unwinnable war. The Viet Cong commander, Hoang Van Thai, survived the war and lived until 2010. He never spoke publicly about Ap Bac in detail, never gave interviews to Western journalists or historians. His battle plan and his leadership that day were recognized by the North Vietnamese government, but he remained a quiet figure, uncomfortable with fame, more concerned with living his life than reliving his past. When he died at 88, his obituary in Vietnamese newspapers mentioned Ap Bac, but didn't dwell on it. One battle among thousands, one small victory in a war that would last another 12 years. The rice paddies, where the battle was fought, are still there. You can visit them if you want. The Vietnamese government has placed a small monument near where the helicopters were shot down, a concrete pillar with an inscription in Vietnamese and English. It says that here, on January the 2nd, 1963, the People's Forces defeated an enemy attack and proved that determination could overcome technology. It doesn't mention the names of anyone who fought there. It doesn't give casualty figures. It's just a marker noting that something happened here once, something important enough to remember but not important enough to explain in detail. Farmers still work those paddies, planting and harvesting rice the way they've done for generations. The land has forgotten the battle. The dikes where Ken Good died have been rebuilt and reworked 1,000 times. The tree line where the Viet Cong dug their positions has been cleared and replanted and cleared again, as the needs of agriculture dictated. Nothing remains of that day except in memory and record. And now, 60 years later, even the memory is fading. The men who fought there are gone or going. The reporters who covered it have died. The families who mourned have moved on or joined their dead. Soon there will be no one left who remembers Ap Bac firsthand, no one who can describe the sound of helicopters falling from the sky or the feeling of lying in the mud while machine gunfire cracked overhead. But the lesson remains. Technology alone cannot win wars. Superior firepower means nothing if the enemy refuses to be intimidated by it. Mobility is worthless if your movements are predictable. And helicopters, no matter how advanced, are still vulnerable to men on the ground who are willing to stand and fight. That's what the Battle of Ap Bac taught in 1963. And it's a lesson that every generation has to learn again, because the specifics change, but the fundamentals don't. 5 helicopters fell at Ap Bac. 3 men died trying to save the crews. And a war that would consume 58,000 American lives and reshape a nation continued for another 12 years, long after everyone should have understood that it couldn't be won the way it was being fought. Sometimes the clearest warnings are the ones we ignore until it's too late to matter.